Hello, everybody. My name is Phil Lanier. I'm president of Coaching Ourselves, and I want to thank you for joining this webinar. We are proud to be able to bring you this fireside chat with our Coaching Ourselves author, Edgar Schein, his colleague and son, Peter Schein, and Jeremiah Lee. To get your free perusal version of Ed Schein's latest Coaching Ourselves module, just send us an email at info@coachingourselves.com or warren@coachingourselves.com. This fireside chat will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. Following this webinar, everyone will receive an email with a link to the recording. I encourage you to share with your colleagues who could not join us. So our host today is Jeremiah Lee from Spencer Stuart. He's an expert in organizational design and transformation, specializing in providing leadership advisory, executive assessment, and organizational culture assessment services to Spencer Stuart clients across industries and geographies. Jeremiah is the creator of multiple organizational change instruments and has led numerous long-term research and development projects and managed large-scale organizational transformational programs. He's experienced at solving highly complex change problems, integrating diverse methodological approaches, and applying systems thinking to social dynamics. On a more personal note, several years back, Jeremiah and myself and Professor Henry Mintzberg and others were going up north for a canoe trip, as we do with Coaching Ourselves many times. And I'll never forget, I only met Jeremiah a short while earlier, and I remember sitting next to him on the bus and watching him, and he was scribbling furiously the tiniest little notes I've seen on a paper with all sorts of involved diagrams. And I sat down and I'm like, "What are you doing, Jeremiah?" And he said he was attempting, at least I remember him saying, he was attempting to merge the various theories of Henry, Ed, and other organizational thinkers into what I interpreted as some sort of broad, abstract understanding of organizations and culture. So Jeremiah is, in my opinion, one of the world's up-and-coming organizational theorists and thinkers. So without further ado, I pass it over to you, Jeremiah, and Ed and Peter.
Well, thank you so much, Phil, for that overly generous introduction. It really is an honor to be part of this discussion, and thank you for hosting this and making the time for all of us to talk about humble leadership and culture. And I'm really excited. I think I can speak for everyone on this call that it's such a joy to learn from Ed and Peter, and to be here together to talk about this important topic and to learn more about the new book that they're publishing as well. So I'll in turn start by introducing Ed and Peter, although I think that they are far less in need of an introduction than I am, so I'll do my best to cover some of the highlights. So first of all, I think that many of us are here today because we're lifelong students of the work that Ed has done. And after spending so much time in this field, I can't think of a single individual who has had more influence and has shaped this field more than Ed. In fact, I was just at a conference a couple weeks ago in Berkeley, and every other presentation, every other speaker was referring to Ed and his work, and it's just a really appreciative sort of way. And yet, what strikes me over the years after listening to Ed and learning from Ed and getting to spend time with him in person is, despite that reality, the amount of humility Ed has maintained throughout the years, and the way he always is helping and engaging all of us. So thank you so much for that. A couple other things to note. Ed, over this 50-year span, has been teaching at MIT as professor emeritus, and has written numbers of books on this topic, on culture, leadership, management, among others. And we'll be talking about one book today, in particular, Humble Leadership. But there's kind of a continuous line of thought that began, in this case, with helping, and a series of other books, such as Humble Inquiry and Humble Consulting and Humble Leadership, that we're going to talk about. And so I'm really excited to think through and hear from Ed and Peter on the themes that cross over all those books. Peter, it's very exciting for me to get to know you more in the last year or so. And what is really neat about this combination is, Peter, your depth of experience and insight as a leader, living and working in Silicon Valley and startup companies such as Pacific Bell and Apple and Sun Microsystems, and experiencing the challenges of leadership and culture firsthand, and now weaving that together with this long line of thinking of the research and the teaching that Ed has done. So to me, it's such a powerful combination. So thank you for sharing your insight as well. So maybe just to get us started, I'll just ask kind of an open question, and that is, across these different books and the lines of thinking, from helping to humble consulting now to humble leadership, what are some of the main themes or messages that you want people to understand, to be talking about? And then maybe what's some new thinking that came with humble leadership that you want people to be aware of?
No,
why don't you start with relationship?
all right. See, we're enough of a partnership now. We can discuss online which of us is going to start, rather than formatting everyone or going by some other principle. For me, the excitement of working with Peter on humble leadership was that it brings together my long history, going all the way back to Kurt Lewin and Douglas McGregor, that this idea that leadership is something that is a group process. Leadership is a group sport. And I want to underline that it's about leadership, not about leaders. Because the most important idea, I think, in this new book for me is that people in positions of power, heads, directors, bosses, CEOs, whatever we call them other than the word leader, won't become leaderly and won't be able to exercise what we later think of as leadership unless they build a relationship with the people that they are convening or heading or whatever. And that relationship enables then leadership to come out of wherever it needs to come out, because it's not always clear that the person in the power position really knows enough to be able to make good decisions. So leadership, it's a group sport, and it hinges on building relationships of openness and trust, so that the people who report to you, your peers and so on, if they have an idea of how to do something new and different and better, which is a definition of leadership for me, they will have the psychological freedom to speak up. Those are some of the key things that are new for me.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, Jeremiah, and thank you for that introduction. Just as a quick aside on that, when Ed was writing his first culture book, I was a social anthropology undergrad, and my sister was pursuing her PhD in social anthropology. Wow. So finally I got around to rejoining the family business. And,
full circle.
Yeah, but the point I wanted to make about my experiences in Silicon Valley is so often you have this interesting mix of a very powerful, iconic, heroic entrepreneur leader, and then very adaptive, chaotic organizations underneath that are highly innovative and highly creative. And the people who often get the most done are the ones who have a leadership approach that doesn't require any formal authority. So the ability to lead with no formal authority is very common in Silicon Valley, and we actually think is sort of increasingly important in this, we use the VUCA term, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And relationships are the key to that. Building trusting and open relationships with people in 360 degrees around you is how leadership can happen, whether or not you have formal authority.
And that in turn, just the last point to underline it, the nature of the problems that organizations face today has changed greatly from being fairly linear, independent roles being coordinated together, a nice machine model, everybody in their the right position and all the gears working together properly. Today, we think much more, the reality is a hydrodynamic model of organizations as fluid, as being bounded in certain ways by the environment, but the environment is also fluid. The result of which is what the person in a position of power faces is unbelievable interdependence in what everything's related to everything else. And that immediately makes that person aware that they can't possibly control that system with just their own best knowledge. They not only have to get information, but they have to figure out relationships that will get new ideas implemented. Just announcing a new strategy doesn't work anymore. It's too complicated. You have to build relationships. And that's where the humility word comes in. And do you want to comment on that?
I think that we've often been asked, how does it relate to Christian humility or Buddhist humility? And I don't think either of us are qualified to answer that question, except to say that in our model, it's something that Ed first referred to, I think, in Humble Inquiry, where you referred to here and now humility. It means the recognition, when you arrive at work today or tomorrow, or when you, go to a big meeting, a recognition that you don't have the answers, that the answers are in the group, and it's more important to try to draw insights out of the group, content as well as context. And so embracing that I don't have the answers and the group knows more than I do, allows you to get, we think, to better answers, to better outcomes. We sometimes like to explain it as if you're in a position of authority, in a role where you have that authority, you can ask questions and get answers. You can get answers to the questions you ask. Our issue is that increasingly you're going to need to get answers to the questions you don't ask, because you don't know all the right questions to ask.
Yeah.
The group may know far more in that regard, because they're all representing different, people are representing different tasks and different contexts. And so drawing that information, and then you as a leader being the convener of people sharing information, and then maybe what distinguishes you is your ability to synthesize that information. Yeah. Some leaders are better at that than others, but all by way of saying it's a matter of drawing information out of the group rather than arriving at work and saying, I know the answers, I'm going to impose them on my team.
I'd love to give an example of that, which actually I encountered quite early in my career. In the 80s, late 70s and 80s, I did some regular consulting for a big European chemical company called Ciba-Geigy. What I encountered there was that it was run by a group of 11 people, and that group had a chair. The chair was what we might have called a CEO, but what I learned is how they operated, which really in a way blew my mind. First of all, I recognized that managing director had very close personal relationships with the other 10 people. They had worked on that by doing a lot of stuff together, but then they had collectively decided that since they were highly divisionalized and had separate product lines, that each of those 10 people had to take a turn for 2 to 3 years running one of those divisions and running one of those functional groups, so that as they grew, those 11 people developed an equal knowledge of all the businesses and all the functions that they were managing. And think of how much better that works as a decision-making unit then having separate division managers argue for their position, having all the functions being champions of their function, and the poor CEO being the only integrator. In our view of leadership, this model of building those relationships, making sure the knowledge is spread, is then the basis for more information surfacing as what you really need to do, which, just to close the example, led them to realizing that industrial chemicals were no longer a good market for them. There was overcapacity. Agricultural chemicals was dying, that the future was in pharmaceuticals. So they began a slow change process toward promoting more of the executives out of the pharmaceutical company, eventually merging with Sandoz. So what today is Ciba-Geigy is part of Novartis.
One thing that you both have referenced that I know is a central theme in the books is the power of relationships and different kinds of relationships and how they're not all created equal. And I was wondering, could you speak a little bit to you have 4 types or levels of relationship with different implications. And so could you kind of break those out, the differences in the 4 types of relationship that you could have?
Sure. I'll do half and Peter will do half. I'll start with the -1 relationship, which is based on domination. The person in charge has all the power and chooses to exercise it. The sweatshop, the place where the subordinates, the direct reports, the employees, often they're immigrants, really are living in a business that is entirely -1 from the relationship point of view. Out of that has evolved what today we think of as bureaucracy and hierarchy, a concept of relationship based on roles that society specifies or that an organization creates to get its work done. And the notion is that the people in those roles should maintain professional distance, do their job, stay in their lane, and that the system, the bureaucracy, the rules will be sufficient to coordinate all the activities. And that works fine for a linear assembly line or a kind of machine-like organizational concept, but it's built on only bring that part of your personality to work that the role requires and maintain professional distance from the other employees. Now, Peter will describe where it goes next.
Maybe with that as the link, then the question is, do we want to work in organizations where what we do is we leave our personality at home and we put on our mask and we go to work and play our role and maintain our professional distance from the people we work with? I don't think people actually do that, but there is such a thing as friends at work. And so I think a lot of that was sort of understanding the kind of the history that started with Taylorism and has sort of gotten us to, at least the turn to this century. And then, in the last decade or so, we've had lots of people that have influenced us who have sort of been saying, look, this notion doesn't really work. And the reason, organizations are more fluid and they're more organic. So what level 2 is about, so again, Ed's described level -1 and level 1. Level 2 basically says, I'm going to throw away the notion that professional distance is positive. And I'm going to say, I want to develop whole Peter Schein to whoever I'm working with, whole person to whole person relationships. I want to know a little bit what's going on in their life because we are in a shared context and we're bringing our own context to work. And without some sense of what that is, we're not going to be as communicating as well. We're not going to share as much information, and we're not going to build trust. Trust is so critical in all of this. So in some of the early books in the Humble Leadership series, Ed referred to personalizing and personalization. And we were at a group a couple of years ago discussing this. And Ed wrote out on the whiteboard, personizing. And it was sort of an epiphany, because we realized that's what we're talking about. It's this whole person to whole person relationship building, built around openness and trust. It's actually quite different from the idea of personalizing, right? You have lots of personalized HR, or you have, all sorts of personalized shopping delivered to your door. The theme of personalization is very salient in our culture right now, but we're really talking about something different. So that begat the term personizing, and we're very apologetic for introducing another jargony term. But the point is, it represents an important distinction from this idea of personalizing, which is important, but personizing means you really are going to be building a whole person to whole person relationship with the key people that you work with. And again, it focuses on the idea of challenging whether professional distance is a good thing. And then just quickly, the last level is level 3, which we describe as sort of intimacy. And this is what you would have with your family. This tends to be, we associate this with the home and with deep personal friendships. But we also know that there is quite a bit of intimacy, either situational or just natural as humans develop relationships with each other, that shows up in the workplace. So we give examples of, a very good example of intimacy is something like a intense high-performing team, SEAL teams, special forces. Those kinds of teams develop relationships with each other that are far beyond what we have described as a level 2 relationship. They have a professional intimacy that is really characterized by the kind of the simple sort of quip is that they can finish each other's sentences. That's where we're so close. We spend so much time together that we've developed an intimacy that's okay at work. I just a quick story on this. I was presenting some of this to a group of academicians and leaders at the Air Force Academy. And I had an Army general come up to me afterwards and say, yeah, our process is we go from level -1 to level 4. And I was like, yeah, I like that. We don't really have a level 4 in our model, but I get what you're saying, that you start with basic training, boot camp, which is pretty level -1, right? If you're a recruit and you go and you have a drill sergeant, that's a domination relationship. It's intended that way. And then you go through the sort of the indoctrination and leadership learning process. And, so often in places like in the military, you do develop these much deeper, intimate, professionally intimate relationships. And I guess maybe most specifically characterized by the fact that life and death is involved in the military in ways that in most corporate settings it's not. And so anyway, I just thought it was interesting that there are big hierarchical contexts that we work in that while we're describing this personalization as this sort of organic and chaotic process, it's not something that doesn't belong in hierarchies. It does belong in hierarchies. It just gets expressed at a number of different layers in the organization.
So as
military,
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
With all of these business teams trying to achieve a higher level of performance, what should they be aspiring to? Is everyone trying to get to level 3? What should teams be aspiring to achieve a higher level of performance?
Let me comment on that, because I think whether it's level 2 or 3, put that aside for a minute, but focus on how most organizations operate at level 1, role relations and rules of how the roles are supposed to relate to each other. All theories say that an effective organization requires a lot of trust up and down the hierarchy. If you ask the question, how do you build trust? Is there any incentive in a role-based organization with professional distance for people in their own roles to help each other? In an individualistic, competitive, hierarchic society, the best way to get your own career managed is to stay in your role.
Yeah.
And if your buddy is failing, good. That gives you an edge on the next promotion.
Yeah.
So the big switch has to be, if helping each other actually becomes important in getting the organization to be more effective, then you must build at least level 2 relationships where I care enough about you that if I see you're in trouble, I'm going to help you rather than celebrate your trouble. So level 2 becomes an essential characteristic of building trust, and trust is the essential characteristic of effectiveness in a complex environment. So the logic is bell clear. You cannot continue to operate in a role-based traditional hierarchy with complex problems, because people will not help each other.
So with the goal there to personalize and to be in relationship where we're helping one another, there feels like, or is there an inherent conflict when you want to scale that across a gigantic organization of 10,000 people? So, inherent in personalizing is, one-on-one, face-to-face interactions. What does a senior executive do when they want to personalize with thousands of their employees? How do they scale that?
See, I don't understand that question, because all we're asking that senior executive to do is to personalize his relationship with his immediate direct reports and create a reward system that encourages them to personalize their relationship with their direct reports. To me, that seems the obvious answer. Nobody is saying the executive should know hundreds of people. But I know lots of CEOs who are proud of the distance between them and their vice presidents. Dumb, foolish. They're not going to create the openness and trust where those vice presidents will tell them the truth about what's really going on in their organization. And then CEOs get caught by surprise. I didn't know this was going on. It's because they did not create a relationship with their immediate subordinates, reports. The word subordinate, I'm being told, is no longer okay, but I still use it all the time. So it has to happen at every level is the answer.
And I think it's a sort of a natural human process. I think that's the other thing that we're trying to suggest, is that this is a positive way to go to work. To say, I've got my agenda, I've got my to-do list, I've got my OKRs, but what I'm really going to work on doing today is building trusting relationships with some of the key people that I interact with. And if I see my boss doing that, I see the CEO doing that, that's how we're talking about it scaling. Not in some sort of big hierarchical linear way, but in a very organic and small group way, because most of the work that we do in organizations is in small groups.
To me, it also raises the question around leadership and culture. And when you want to scale some of these notions, culture plays a big role, and no one knows that better than you. There's a wonderful thing that you've written about where leaders can become products, creators, and victims of culture. And I was just wondering if you could share some examples or thoughts around when leaders start to engage in new kinds of relationships. Are there examples when engaging as in humble leadership, the act of humble leadership, can interact with the culture or create a culture of humble leadership? Or on the other side of it, can cultures constrain one's ability to engage in humble leadership? And what are some cautionary tales or advice you would have for us around that?
Well, I think the question around culture, of course, is where does culture come from? Culture comes from a founder, an entrepreneur, saying, I've got an idea and I'm going to hire a few people who share that idea with me, and we're going to try to do something. And if it doesn't work, we're never going to hear about it again. But if it does work, they produce a new product, service, whatever. Those direct reports that entrepreneur created begin to believe that how that entrepreneur does things, his or her own beliefs and values must be right because we're succeeding. And as it becomes a group process, we all share now the entrepreneur's values. That's what we call a culture. It's a shared set of values now. Now, when that scales in size and success and age, the outer culture, the macro culture, begins to influence that process. So in a society that's very individualistic and very hierarchical, as that little organization grows, and we see this happening in Silicon Valley all the time, there is a tendency not to continue at each level the personizing that was true up to 10, 20, maybe 100 people, but to regress, and I use that term deliberately, to regress to the level 1 bureaucratic structure. Well, all right, if we've got layers now, we better define roles. And inevitably, in an individualistic competitive system, the roles are going to be individual leader type roles, and they're going to compete with each other. And so the culture of the larger company will become that hierarchical bureaucratic culture that will now specify that the best leaders are the ones who can play the best competitive game to earn their way up to the top. So an entrepreneur now says, hey, I want to create a group and do something a little different. And the board and the senior executives say, no, we're not going to allocate money to that. That's not us anymore, until they get disrupted by another company. So the bureaucratization process begins to say a leader should be someone who can work in our system. And then at the same time we say, but how are we going to innovate? Because that kind of person will do what the board wants and what the market wants, and will not be able to innovate until that person has the crashing mindset insight. My God, I've got to do something about the culture I live in and own.
Yeah.
And that can best be done by traveling, by getting outside, by developing friendships outside, mergers, acquisitions, although they often simply blur what you've acquired. So the paradox of culture is it's created by entrepreneurs, but when it gets big, it limits innovation.
And is that process inevitable? as the kind of the big bureaucratic mindsets and structures set in, what can we do to slow that down or prevent it?
What I just said, senior executive board members have to get outside their own culture and have somehow the mindset insight that if we just keep going with what has been successful in the past, we are going to be vulnerable to disruption. There are enough examples now of how that happens with competing companies that size alone becomes a handicap, even as the theory says size is better from a marketing and some other points of view.
Yeah.
But if size means cultural uniformity, it becomes a vulnerability.
What if executives and board members don't want to get out and engage in that kind of relationship, and you know, a different kind of mentality sets in that might be more narcissistic? It can humble leadership serve as a countervailing force to, you know, kind of the notions of power and control? How can those forces kind of come in alignment with one another?
Well, I mean, I do think that there's, you know, we get into this sort of, you know, these archetypes of despotic leaders and, you know, uprisings from below. I mean, I think in a way that's what you're describing, that if the organization sees that there's a, let's call it a toxic culture being imposed from leaders whose values have started to become out of alignment from what, you know, the groups that are actually producing product are the values that they're living by, then, you know, those gaps, and we would describe those as gaps between the underlying assumptions and the espoused values that in the sort of culture model in Ed's books. I think the issue there is that it's a pretty lonely place if you're the CEO and are you know, imposing what are sort of perceived to become toxic values on an organization. And you know, if you're able to survive that, good for you. But there are more examples of CEOs who haven't been able to survive that. There's a big shared ride transportation company that's gone through something similar to this, where there started to be a very palpable perceived gap between what the engineers and the marketing people valued and what it appeared the CEO valued. And what happened is the board removed him. So I just think that at some level, if you have these large drifts, these large gaps between the underlying assumptions and the sort of deeply held values of the CEO as being, you know, drifting away from the deeply held beliefs and values of the people who are producing the company's core products, you're going to have issues. You're going to, those discontinuities have to be resolved one way or the other. I think that you know, this is why we've seen examples like, you know, the holacracy experiment of Zappos is very important for us to think about how do you, you know, how do you create some sort of synthesis of a very charismatic, heroic leader and a way of organizing in self-managed teams that are able to sort of, you know, reconcile and maintain innovation rather than having it become too static and too top-down and too sort of charisma-driven.
Well, Zappos is kind of an example, reverse example, in the senior executive who wanted to create those kinds of personalized relationships, and yet, you know, I remember reading about many managers did not want that. There was kind of a mass exodus of managers who wanted to maintain some distance.
Exactly.
So they're
like 25%. was
Yeah.
the number quoted, which is sort of stunning, but it seemed like Tony Hsieh was willing for that to happen.
Right.
So but again, that's sort of one example, one point in time, but I think it's a very valuable experiment for us to all learn from. One of the other books that was fairly influential in the writing of, at least for me, in the writing of Humble Leadership, is the Lalou book, where he talks about these, what he describes as teal organizations that have also sort of worked out ways that are much more organic and sort of humanistically oriented, as opposed to being a kind of a machine model that has this perception of being infinitely scalable, but it's only scalable until it breaks. And I think the argument that Lalou would make is that teal organizations are more adaptive. And so anyway, we could go into a long discussion about that.
There is a simple answer based on companies that have grown and succeeded. I think the answer is diversification. I think the great companies have divisionalized and have created a situation where either product divisions or markets or R&D is encouraged to develop its own subculture and trying to learn from variations inside yourself. Because as the environment gets more complex, the organization has to be able to adapt to more different complexities, and therefore diversity inside the organization is the shortest answer to your question. If you don't want to fall prey to being a bureaucracy and becoming completely inward oriented, you have to find ways of letting the outside in. And one way to do that is to have parts of you that is connected to different parts of the outside.
And I think implicit in all of the work that you've been doing is that this act of humility and appreciative inquiry and the relationships are a way, no matter where you sit in an organization, to engage and to get around the inevitability that the cycles that go through. So, I think implied in the act of humble leadership is a way around some of those ruts that organizations get into. And so I was being a bit playing the devil's advocate, but there are many examples in the book that I've loved learning about on how to get around those pitfalls. So I encourage others who have not read it to kind of pour through the books and the practical examples. So Phil, do you think this is a good time to maybe open up the floor to some questions from the broader group? I see some in the chat window. Some questions have been coming in.
Yes, Jeremiah, there's a ton of questions, and I'm just scrambling to keep up and try to categorize all of these. So let me start with a couple of questions. You guys can hear me well?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there's a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to read about 3 or 4 questions that all are essentially the same, but just so you can hear the different responses. So Deborah asks, how do you facilitate change with a supervisor who thinks she is at level 3, but who clearly operates at -1? And there's another question similar to that from a colleague of mine, Atif, who asks, I want to ask both of you how we can transform self-righteous, narcissistic, and all-knowing leaders into humble leaders. It does not seem like people are motivated to do this.
That's a good question.
And just 2 others along the same trend. How does the self-interest of the vast majority of the C-level reconcile with humble leadership? Is it possible? And finally, why do executives never, to the best of my knowledge, go down the road of humble leadership? What are the obstacles? Over to you guys.
Well, I can't help but answer the very first version of the question. How you deal with a boss who may believe they're level 3 or 2, but operate at level -1. The quickest answer I've observed is in my grandchildren. At least 3 of them have left those organizations. you know, they have perceived these bosses as unfixable. And so they walk out. And that may be at some level the most important thing we see going on generationally, that generation is less tolerant of level -1 or even level 1. And so organizations will get hollowed out with the wrong kind of talent if they keep creating bosses like that and don't learn from it. That would be one solution. The other solution is, interestingly, the big data survey stuff. At least in medicine, doctors who really behave badly to patients and nurses get picked up on the surveys that the hospital unit or even the government has begun to mandate. And there are now boards in hospitals assigned to identifying toxic leaders, bringing them up for some kind of review and withholding rewards until they go see counselors. That's an expensive solution, but it's one of the things that I see working, at least in medicine.
I would just add that there does seem to be a sort of palpable psychographic and demographic shift in, whether we refer to millennial or Generation Z, values around work and life. And so part of my thought on, how do we deal with the C-suite that really is motivated by kind of transactional level 1 thinking, is that may be true, but I just don't think it'll be true in 20 years, because the value set of the 25-year-old today, unless we're reading this completely wrong, and those values get abandoned for level 1 transactionalism as people get more power. I suppose that's going to happen in some cases, but the zeitgeist right now is a little different than that, as I read it. And as I look at my kids who are wired a little bit differently than I was. So in that sense, we're sort of optimistic that this is a kind of a natural progression that, we hope continues.
Peter and Ed, isn't there an assumption, isn't built into the philosophy of humble leadership, an assumption that when you personalize and engage with someone as a whole being, even if it's a senior executive who thinks they're at level 3 and is actually level 1, it gives them the opportunity to transform in that moment as a whole person, that you get, you give them that feed, that a young person has the courage to say, hey, you're not level 2. I'm experiencing you as level -1, and they have the opportunity to grow, to change.
I would like to believe that works, but I think the person trying that on their boss is running both a risk that they won't be understood or punished, or will find what I find a lot in the safety area, where it's very important that you get this. The worst problem in the safety area is not the failure of people to speak up, but the fact that the boss says, I hear you, we're going to do something about it, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
The boss is overloaded, here's the message, but in the boss's reward system, productivity still overrides. So that boss even may say to herself, I know I'm being a level -1 boss, but I got no choice because my boss keeps wanting to meet the numbers. And the only way I can meet the numbers is to run my group like a sweatshop.
Yeah.
So the system won't change unless it starts personalizing at the top, so that those bad bosses themselves get a different reward system imposed upon them. Otherwise, there's no incentive for them to change.
Yeah.
So if you don't want me to run you that way, tough, go somewhere else. I can replace you.
Yep.
Ed, Peter, and Jeremiah, I'm going to just read out 2 or 3 other sort of questions or comments that draw from that and present some of the issues that people have mentioned as, you know, trying to do this change, and I'd like to hear your comments. So one person writes, many of us, including white men, cover some aspects of our whole self at work because we are afraid of being judged by others. Another person adds, often tough business decisions and intensity of business, intimacy seems an unnecessary hindrance, or close relationships. Nice to have, but unrealistic. And then finally, another person adds, too much work to do and not enough time to care about much other than the work is often the situation we have seen. Do we honestly think we are ready for everyone to bring their whole selves to come to work?
It's the wrong question. The question is, does the job require openness and trust? If the job can be done without openness and trust, if you don't need the help of the other people, if you've got everything you need going for you, I don't see why I mean, there are lots of jobs in the world that are so routine that you're glad that you don't have to bring your whole personality, but you can get the job done. So the pressure for this level 2 is not a pressure to be nicer to each other, or wouldn't society be better, or having all kinds of vague values. The pressure from my point of view is, if you don't get to level 2, the job won't get done. Safety, quality, schedule, all will get compromised because the information won't surface what you need to do. You'll have accidents. People will withhold information. The pressure is not in putting a value on level 2. The pressure is in, you're going to have to know each other in order to get the job done. I mean, how do you imagine Peter and I could write a book together if we didn't trust each other to say this sentence doesn't work, this idea is no good, whatever it is that would make a final product better? So it's not my choice to be more than a parent, to be a colleague and a friend. It's driven by the task.
The other comment that we make in the book is that this is sort of one way of sorting out what the risks are with to work of automation, AI, machine learning, whatever we want to call it. That the kinds of tasks that are highly transactional and highly routinized are the ones that are far more at risk to being an AI replacing a human. And so our one of the implicit challenges in the Humble Leadership book is to think about where the innovation is going to come from, is where openness and trust creates a sharing of information that a machine would never be able to do. The smartest AI in the world doesn't have yet, hopefully, for at least for our futures, our lives, doesn't have that spark of creativity, of association and triangulation that a human group has. And and generally we think that people are going to seek that kind of work, as opposed to seeking jobs that are just routinized and transactional, because again, those are the ones that are more subject to being automated out by by inorganic processes.
I think there's a fundamental point about not confusing level 2 with being nice, which is very easy to project into it. Getting to know each other includes getting to know each other's limitations, each other's bad points as well as good points, and in getting work done, figuring out how to work with all these variations. The problem with level 1 is we never learn what those variations are. So the group, instead of adapting to each other's skills and limitations, ends up at a lowest common denominator of hiding everything. And then you wonder, like with the Bay of Pigs, where Kennedy was convinced by a few generals to try an invasion, while a bunch of other people sat there in the group and they knew or thought they knew that this would fail, but didn't feel the need to speak up. And so we had this huge disaster. And what Kennedy did on the subsequent decisions, he learned at least to create 2 groups, and had one group doing one decision and the other group doing the other decision, so that at least when these 2 groups competed, all the information surfaced better than in a single group. But I want to emphasize this is very pragmatic, what we're saying. If you're going to deal with complex problems, like we're seeing more and more of them in medicine, what goes on in the operations room, what happens to a patient through their whole hospital career. If you don't have level 2 and if people don't open up and start trusting each other, things just aren't going to work. It's as simple as that.
Excellent, thank you. Just for everyone, I'm going to share a closing screen, but I'm going to keep asking questions, and our panelists are still going to be online. So let me just share the closing screen and remind everybody that you can send an email to Warren@CoachingOurselves or info@CoachingOurselves at any point in time, and we'll send you a free perusal version of Ed's latest Coaching Ourselves module. So back to the questions. There was one interesting question. There's many interesting questions, guys, here. There's one that came through, and I know, Jeremiah, you spent 10 years in Asia. So one of the questions here is humble leadership applicable to all cultural ethnic groups geography? What about China, India, Middle East? They may see humble leadership as weak leadership. They may better tolerate strong and even arrogant leadership than just humility.
Ed, do you want to take that one first? I can have a stab at it.
Well, my previous answer applies. If they get the job done, if China can compete technologically and product-wise with their autocratic leadership, so be it. But I just don't believe they will find that they can do it. I think autocracies discover that they can only do certain limited things. The most interesting example would be General McChrystal writing a book called Team of Teams, saying even the military, the most hierarchical system in the world, can't function without trust and openness, and that requires building level 2 relationships throughout the organization. I'm sure that the Chinese leaders have learned from their own experience that just planning everything centrally and imposing things onto the organization just doesn't work, and that the great companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Haier have figured out ways to distribute leadership in such a way that information flows. Because without information, they're dead.
Yeah. I can say, after having worked in China in particular for a decade, at least China, but I think a number of Asian cultures have a heightened appreciation for the power of relationships to deliver better outcomes for yourself and for your organization. They even have a specialized word in China called guanxi, which is a kind of relationship. which appreciates the value and the importance of relationships. And you can, if you think of kind of culture arising from founding members, if you look in the history of China, where I think American culture and Western culture was much more fiercely individualistic. So when, at the height of our prime as nations, we go out and we conquer and we imperialize. China, I recall, they sent out gift voyages, gift ship, envoys of their best people sending gifts around the world, whether that's spices and tea, just to form relationships. And they felt there was power in giving gifts and letting people know how successful they had been as a culture. And to me, that speaks to the appreciation, the historical and cultural appreciation they have for what that kind of relationship can give you.
I guess one other comment to that is that we could sort of look at every state in the US and say that their receptivity to what we're talking about in humble leadership is going to vary by some of the implicit assumptions in their macro cultures in red state, blue state, Midwest, coastal, all of those macro culture variations are going to create different interpretations and different reactions to what we're talking about. But I should also point out that, a lot of this work that came out of humble leadership and humble consulting started with humble inquiry, where, Ed was kind of pissed off at how individualistic the US was trending. And I think the question that we're going to have, particularly over the next year, is that really in the US, is that really who we are? I don't think Bernie Sanders is a socialist, but I do think he has some sort of, collective ideas that are quite different from his opponent. And we're challenging this. We're struggling as as citizens of the U.S. of what we think is the right way to cast this in the future. And we're not trying to oversell the importance of humble leadership in that light, but it's closely related thematically. It's part of the zeitgeist.
The example that popped into my head on why relationships and collaboration are so important is the Boeing case. I think in the end, the Boeing problem is partly a problem of deregulation and regulatory mechanisms and inspections and so on that the system was counting on, that the society was counting on, became less and less effective at the same time as the individualism, every business on its own, encouraged Boeing to be more competitive in a very competitive market. And so the combination of internal mistakes or not paying attention or not doing the most safe possible thing, combined with a government that says, let's all do things on our own, and when they don't work, then we'll come in with regulations. That separation and failing of building relationships between industry and government is right now a big problem, because I think business has to have its principles, but government has to have its relationship of creating a climate that leads to higher safety and higher effectiveness. You can't have them as independent systems, which is the way we're heading.
Well, there's many questions more, and they keep coming, and more discussion. Unfortunately, I know that you guys are up against a hard deadline in a couple of minutes. So I think I'd like to wrap it up here perhaps, and open it up if you'd like to sort of share any last words or any comments vis-a-vis any of the themes today. Over to you.
Well, one comment I would make is, let's not get obsessed with all the negative examples we see. There are in the world today, in the world of government and in the world of business and in medicine and in the other functions of society, there are lots of humble leaders around. We have to identify them, and we have to see how they work and learn from them. This is not a model that we are proposing that is unknown. Our book is full of examples historically of great humble leaders who had the insight to function that way. And they exist today right around us. So let's pay more attention, give them more credit, honor them more, instead of this obsession with trying to identify single individuals who are going to somehow lead us out of this wilderness. Let's find single individuals who have already done this and see what they do.
And I guess the one term that hasn't really come up today that is very important and informative in our work is the idea of sort of a mindfulness at work. We talk a lot about that as a personal thing, but I'm also kind of obsessed with the idea of mindfulness in the groups in which you work. And so a lot of that is kind of thinking about not just the what are we doing, asking that question, because that's very positive to sort of check in with each other, what are we doing? But to start really taking the time to ask, how are we doing it? And how well are we doing it? We're so focused on the content of what we do. That's one thing that's been driven hard out of 20 or 30 years of Silicon Valley, that it's all about creating that new thing. But more and more, I want to start us asking, less important right now for the next 5 minutes with what we're doing. What's more important right now is we take the time to ask, how are we doing it? And, are we performing well as a group? Again, regardless of what we're doing, how well is our group functioning? Start questioning the kind of the how. Your CEO is going to be questioning the why. Everybody tends to be focused on what, but spend some time thinking about how. How well are we doing this, regardless of what it is?
And that may be where the greatest need for leadership exists, that we're not managing the how well enough.
Excellent. Jeremiah, do you have any last words for us?
I think one question that kept coming up that was, I think, important was examples of humble leaders today. And I think just to draw people's attention to the book again and to read through, there are some really great examples of humble leadership. And we've talked about some of the perils of not achieving humble leadership. But I think there's some really inspiring examples. In the work that I've done, I've been really, really excited to meet some people who kind of radiate and ripple out those personalized relationships and how that transforms the culture. So I think there really are some exciting examples. What one I just read about last week was the Satya Nadella book, Hit Refresh. And if half of the things they're writing about in that book are true, and how he's turning more authentic relationships and a growth mindset into value, that's a pretty powerful example as just one specific case.
Yeah, and from somebody who's been observing that company for a long time, from Apple in the 90s to now, they're transforming. That's a big company that's able to change itself. So I think that's a very illuminating example. So, good call.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining the webinar today. It's been a great pleasure to be able to deliver this, offer this to everybody. Thank you, Jeremiah and Ed and Peter, for your time, and everybody here is thanking you quite a lot. It's absolutely wonderful to see all these questions. A quick note: everyone's been asking if this this chat thread is available, and I hit save the thread at the last moment. I hope it saved all of the thread, but we will be sure to send it to everybody, assuming it got saved properly. And once again, the book, Humble Leadership, you can find it at Amazon and elsewhere. And if you want Ed Schein's Coaching Ourselves module for perusal, just send us an email, info@coachingourselves.com. Have a great day, everybody.
Actually, Phil, if I can just add one other thing. We didn't mention that our Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute, OCLI.org, is a resource and a way for people to get in touch with us. So a lot of people may have logged off, but OCLI.org tells a little bit more about us, and they can reach us through that site.
Excellent. And for everyone's knowledge, the email that you will get next day, tomorrow, with a link to the webinar will also include a link to OCLI.org so that you'll have that there and you can check these resources out. They are very good. Once again, thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure to talk to you.